Hello and welcome. This video covers the second part of the Etude number 5 in G major by Ferling, music that's being used for the all-region tryouts in Texas for 2021. If you recall our previous conversation, this etude is fairly long, and even though it looks like a lot of 16th notes, the counting is in 4 beats per bar. We're going to be focusing today on measures 9 through 16. Now, prior to working with this section, this video, you should do like I did before I made this video. I did a warm-up, I selected some reeds, put them in water, chose the one I'm going to use, did some long tones, and played the G major scale up to high E, down to low B, and back to G, the extended range of the G major scale. With that in mind, let's now look at the selection that we're going to be working with today, measures 9 through 16. Measures 9 through 16 are all in the key of G major, and even though there's some accidentals, it is a very accessible part of the composition. So I'll play one note before we begin. Now, before we get into the details of measures 9 through 16, let's first start looking at the counting. Remember that it's 4 beats in a bar, so the rhythms are not nearly as hard as they appear. Here's the counting for 9 through 16. Count along with me. 1 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3, 4 and 1 and 2, a 3 and 4, a 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, pullet 2, pullet triplet 1, 3. Okay, now let's get into the details. We'll start with the overall skeleton or background of measures 9, 10, 11, which is really just a rise from A to B to C. So we play that skeleton, the first notes of 9, 10, 11. It's really just a simple three-note scale pattern, but we have a breath that interrupts it. But you'll notice the rise of A, B, and C tell us that C is kind of the peak. Even though I don't have it marked on there, overall, we'd like to crescendo just a little bit, direct our energy toward that peak. That's the C at the beginning of measure 11. Now let's take a look at the breath mark in measure 10. Most players will actually not need to breathe. If you don't need to breathe, don't worry about it. But do put a small break there. I would strongly urge you, don't let the amount of break change the tempo. So here's an example of the breath in place where the tempo doesn't change. The goal being to put the breath on the second count of the bar and let it take up half a count of space. If you really need to breathe, probably you're not going to have time to open your mouth and breathe. Instead, just get a nose full of air. If you don't need to breathe, just put a half a count of rest so that any judge knows, okay, you observed the breath mark. Now let's look at measure 11. There's a number of wide leaps in that measure. Before we put them all together, let's make sure we're ready to play each of the leaps separately. Here's the first one, C down to D, B down to D, A down to D, G sharp down to D. Now we're ready to try putting them all together. The secret to the technique is to keep the fingers close to the keys, especially the right hand fingers. So if you think about measure 11, the high C being the peak of 9 and 10, we will put a decrescendo from 11 down to the beginning of 13. Now we've got this D major arpeggio coming up in measure 12. It looks like a very complicated measure, but it's not. It's just D arpeggio. Play notes 1, 3, 5, and 7. 1, 3, 5, 7, and 8. 1, 3, 5, 7, 8, and the first note of the next measure. There's a long D major arpeggio. The other tones are just half steps before them. So what we'll do is, of course, we'll later take a look at that and remember that E sharp is really F. So each of the parts of the arpeggio have a neighbor that's a half step away. Now we're ready to put together 11 and 12 as one unit. 9 and 10 were a crescendo, so 11 and 12 will be primarily a diminuendo. Now let's look at the second half of this section. The peak of the phrase is the B natural at the beginning of 14, not the high D. We're going to take great pain to make sure that the B before the breath mark is the louder note and the high D is not really very loud. So let's build up to it with 13. Once you play measure 13 up to the B natural in 14, compare your volume with the note before the breath to the note after the breath. Now let's take a look at the second breath of this section, the beginning of measure 14. You're definitely going to need a breath here. Take it. Don't worry too much about being exactly in time with the metronome. There's no way you can take the breath adequately and stay in time. Don't try it. I'm going to demonstrate what it would sound like if we tried it. 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 1 and 2, and you hear the audible breath. That's going to take away from the experience for the listener. So instead, take a little bit extra time so we don't hear a gasp. By taking a little bit extra time at the breath mark, you're going to ensure that the listener is not distracted by the breathing sounds, and it will give you just a tiny bit of time to get that high D embouchure set for a good attack and tone. Now let's review the rhythm in measure 15 because it's the only time that we're going to have all these triplets together in this section. We have triplet, two-pulet, triplet. Notice the tie in there. So review the rhythm before you try to play it, and then say the rhythm to yourself before you play it on the oboe. If you can say it, you can play it. Now let's take a look at the articulation at the end of measure 15. It's something we normally don't see. You have dots and a slur. For the young player, the obvious thought is, wait, you can't do both at the same time. And of course, you're right, you can't. It's a special kind of articulation called portato, meaning to carry. It's originally a string articulation where the bow would move in one direction and there would be the tiniest of gap in the sound. Some people in woodwinds and brass refer to it as half staccato. To play a portato, first contrast legato and staccato. There's the end of measure 15 legato. There's the end of measure 15 staccato. Now let's shoot for something in the middle. Notice that the loudest note of measure 15 is the high C. That's going to be easy to do. And then you play the portato coming away from it. Now let's take a look at how to end this section of the composition. The first step that we would like to look at is how we're going to handle the tempo. The retard is placed in a very weird spot, and many students try to do the retard early. I think the easiest thing is to don't do the retard until the beginning of measure 16. Therefore, 15 rhythm is triplet 2, triplet, triplet 1. So the retard will begin at the beginning of measure 16. Therefore, 15 going into 16 will sound strictly in tempo. Then think of the retard as a little bit of slowing down over measure 16. 1, 3. The other aspect of planning for measure 16 is the last note, the G on top of the staff. It tends to be sharp. It tends to have a sound that's not quite as good as other notes if your reed is not good. So we've got to think of those things, and it's a full value note, and we need vibrato on it. So we'll think about the retard during measure 16, and then the G is the softest note. 1, 2, 3. If, despite your best efforts, the G is still really sharp, there is a hack you can do. In addition to the fingers for the high G, you can add the low B natural key, which gives the G a little extra resonance and will lower the pitch. Test it with a tuner and listen to it to see if that hack is something that you want to try to do. Remember that during your practice, for this section as well as all the other sections, your first consideration should be tone quality. Make sure you're using your best sound at all times, using vibrato. Let tone be your first consideration before you try to do anything fast. Remember, set goals for this section. Journal your practice every day. What measure or measures did you work on? What tempo did you use? Briefly journal your reactions to it. How did you feel about it? Did it go well? If not, what did you not like? This will help keep you focused towards the all-region tryouts. Remember, everyone, the progress toward the complete performance is a series of many steps. It will take you some weeks before you recognize you've made a large amount of progress. Be patient and practice every day. This is the end of part 2 for etude number 5.